Darren had never imagined that a simple wrong turn could lead him into an alien world. The day had started like any other, an ordinary hike in the remote forests near his cabin. But what had begun as a peaceful walk in nature quickly turned into something far beyond his understanding. The sky was starting to turn orange with the setting sun, and the air was crisp. Darren had wandered off the beaten path, following a trail that seemed to stretch endlessly in front of him. As he walked deeper into the dense trees, the familiar sounds of nature grew faint, replaced by an eerie silence. He frowned. Something didn't feel right. The trees around him were larger, their branches twisted in strange patterns, as if they weren't of this world. It was as if he had stepped into a different dimension altogether. He thought about turning back, but before he could, he saw a flash of movement out of the corner of his eye. Startled, he spun around, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw the figure standing in the distance. A woman, but not like anyone he had ever seen before. Her skin had a faint shimmer, almost as if it glowed under the fading light. She was tall and graceful, her features sharp yet oddly beautiful. Her eyes, glowing with an otherworldly light, stared directly at him. For a moment, Darren froze, unsure of what to do. The woman didn't seem threatening, but there was something about her presence that felt like it belonged to another world entirely. Who are you?" Darren asked, his voice shaky, but trying to remain calm. He wasn't sure if he should run or stay put. The alien woman tilted her head slightly, studying him with curiosity. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. The smile was warm, playful even, completely disarming him. She stepped forward, and her voice was melodic, smooth like a song, though it didn't sound like anything Darren had ever heard before. "I could ask you the same thing, human," she replied with a teasing tone. "But perhaps I should have some fun with you first." Darren blinked in confusion. Fun? What did she mean by that? But before he could gather his thoughts, the alien woman continued. "I'm Lyra, and I've got a challenge for you, human," she said with a mischievous gleam in her eyes. "If you accept, I'll reward you in ways you can't even imagine." Darren raised an eyebrow. A challenge? Reward? What was going on here? He hadn't come out for some alien encounter or to be part of some strange game. Yet there was something about her, something intriguing, that made him want to know more. Challenge? Darren echoed, skeptical but curious. What kind of challenge are we talking about here? Lyra grinned, clearly enjoying the moment. A series of tests. They will test your strength, your wit, your endurance. If you pass, I'll give you a reward you will never forget. Darren chuckled nervously. This was bizarre, but at the same time, something in him felt excited. He had no idea what he was getting into, but he had always enjoyed a good challenge. Maybe this was just some strange, fun experience he'd never forget. "All right, I'll bite," Darren said, shrugging. "What are these tests you have in mind?" Lyra's eyes sparkled with excitement, as if she had been waiting for him to agree all along. She raised a hand, and with a flick of her wrist, a strange device appeared in her palm. It shimmered with alien symbols and patterns, glowing in the twilight. "The first test is simple," Lyra said, her voice serious now. "I want you to reach the highest peak of this forest within an hour. It's not as easy as it sounds, and there's more. While you're doing that, I'll be watching you closely." Darren hesitated for a moment. The forest was dense and vast, and reaching the peak within an hour sounded nearly impossible. But he wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially not from something so unusual. "All right, Lyra. I accept your challenge," he said, his voice filled with determination. Lyra smiled again, this time a little softer, as if she was pleased with his response. "Good," she said. "I'll be watching. But remember, this is just the first test. If you fail, you'll be disqualified." Darren took a deep breath, looking at the distant peak she had pointed to. It was far, much farther than he had anticipated. He wasn't sure what was waiting for him on the way up, but he had no choice now. He had accepted the challenge, and there was no turning back. "Then I'll get going," Darren said, his heart racing in his chest. "I'll make it to the top in an hour. Just wait and see." Lyra watched him with interest, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "I'm looking forward to it," she said, stepping aside as Darren began his ascent. As he moved forward, Darren couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary challenge. There was something about Lyra, something captivating and otherworldly, that made him wonder just how much he was really getting himself into. But for now, the challenge was all that mattered. And with every step he took, he couldn't help but feel that this strange encounter with an alien woman might turn out to be much more than he could ever imagine. Darren took a deep breath as he stared up at the towering peak in front of him. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. He had an hour to make it to the top of that mountain. A challenge that seemed almost impossible, especially considering the unfamiliar alien landscape surrounding him. But something about the alien woman, Lyra, had sparked a fire within him. She was mysterious, beautiful, and her playful attitude had intrigued him more than he cared to admit. He adjusted the straps on his backpack and started walking. The forest was thick with strange plants, some of them glowing faintly in the twilight. The path to the peak was unclear, and Darren realized that he would have to rely on his instincts and his resourcefulness to navigate the strange terrain. He wasn't a stranger to tough hikes, but this was something else entirely. As he pushed forward, the air grew cooler and the forest grew denser. The trees were tall and twisted, their branches stretching out like arms reaching for the sky. The ground beneath his boots was uneven, with rocks and roots that seemed to appear out of nowhere, tripping him up at every turn. He knew he couldn't afford to waste time, so he pushed through the difficulty, reminding himself of the promise Lyra had made. The challenge was about more than just reaching the peak. It was a test of his ability to adapt and push beyond his limits. Darren wiped sweat from his brow as he moved deeper into the forest. He could feel the weight of the hour hanging over him. He glanced at his wristwatch. 45 minutes had already passed. The sun was now dipping behind the horizon, and the forest was quickly becoming dark. But that didn't stop him. In fact, the approaching darkness made him more determined than ever. A voice suddenly broke through the quiet. "You're doing well, human." Darren froze for a moment, looking around. He hadn't heard anyone approach, and yet he could sense that Lyra was watching him. He squinted into the dimming light, but saw nothing. There was a soft chuckle from somewhere in the distance. She was toying with him, but in a way, it felt encouraging, as if she wanted him to succeed. "Keep going. But don't think this will be easy." Lyra's voice echoed again, this time louder, as if it were coming from everywhere at once. "The harder the climb, the greater the reward." Darren gritted his teeth. He didn't need anyone to remind him. He had accepted this challenge, and now nothing was going to stop him. He had no idea what was waiting for him at the top, but one thing was clear. He wasn't just climbing to win a prize. There was something more at stake here, something deeper. The way Lyra had looked at him earlier, with that twinkle in her eyes, made him wonder if there was more to their meeting than mere chance. The path became steeper as Darren pushed forward. Every step felt harder than the last, and his legs burned from the effort. The forest was eerily silent now, with only the sound of his heavy breathing filling the air. He tried to block out the fatigue, focusing only on the summit. He could see it now, just barely visible in the distance, a rocky outcrop at the top of the mountain, barely touched by the fading sunlight. With renewed determination, he quickened his pace, though the terrain was becoming increasingly difficult. As he scrambled up a particularly steep section, his foot slipped, and he tumbled backward, catching himself just in time before falling. He cursed under his breath, but there was no time to waste. The hour was ticking away, and he was determined not to fail. "Are you all right, human?" Lyra's voice came again, calm and unbothered. Darren stood up and dusted himself off, frustration bubbling inside him. "I'm fine," he called back, though his voice was strained. "This is nothing." But the truth was, he was starting to feel the weight of the challenge. The mountain didn't just test his physical strength. It seemed to challenge his willpower, too. As he pushed himself onward, he began to think about the strange alien woman who had set this task for him. Why had she chosen him? What was the point of this challenge? Was it really just about a reward, or was it something else? He couldn't stop wondering. The path narrowed as he neared the final stretch. The last few steps to the peak were rocky and treacherous, and the fading light made everything more difficult to see. Darren's heart raced. He could hear the wind whistling through the trees, and the world seemed to hold its breath as he took each step. With only 10 minutes left on the clock, Darren reached the final rock ledge. He could see the peak now, just a few feet above him. His arms and legs were exhausted, but he climbed higher, every movement becoming more strained. The final push was within reach. One more step, and he would have completed the challenge. Just as his fingers brushed the top of the rock, he heard a soft sound behind him. He whipped around, startled. But there was nothing there, only the deep forest and the quiet of the mountain. Was it Lyra, or just his imagination playing tricks on him? Then, without warning, Lyra's voice echoed in his mind. "You've made it. Congratulations, human." Darren's breath came in short gasps as he pulled himself over the ledge, finally standing at the top. His heart pounded in his chest, both from exhaustion and from the thrill of victory. He had done it. He had reached the summit in time. But as he looked down, he couldn't help but feel that the real challenge was just beginning. Darren stood at the peak, breathing heavily as he surveyed the view before him. The mountains stretched out in all directions, the vast expanse of forest and sky blending together in a breathtaking panorama. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a canvas of stars. He had made it. He had completed the challenge. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on his body, he felt an incredible sense of accomplishment. He had climbed the peak, defied the odds, and most importantly, he had proven something to himself. But just as he was about to sit down and catch his breath, a voice echoed through the quiet air. "Well done, human." Darren turned around to find Lyra standing a few feet away from him, her silhouette glowing softly under the starlight. Her presence was almost ethereal, like something out of a dream. She looked calm, composed, as if the entire ordeal had been nothing more than a casual stroll for her. But Darren knew better. There was something powerful about her, something mysterious. "You did it," Lyra continued, her eyes scanning him with a mixture of admiration and amusement. "I didn't think you'd make it, but you proved me wrong." Darren chuckled, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I guess I can surprise people when I put my mind to it." Lyra smiled, her expression softening slightly. For a brief moment, the playful edge in her voice disappeared, replaced by something deeper. "You've earned your reward, human," she said, stepping closer. Darren's heart raced as she approached him. He had thought about this moment for the entire climb. He had imagined what kind of reward Lyra would offer, but now, with her standing so close, the idea of what was to come made him feel a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "What's my reward?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever she had planned, but there was a part of him that couldn't wait to find out. Lyra paused for a moment, her eyes locking with his. There was something different in her gaze now. It wasn't the playful challenge he had seen before. This was something more intense, more profound. It was as though, in the space of those few seconds, the air between them thickened with an unspoken understanding. Instead of responding immediately, Lyra reached out and touched his arm. Her fingers were warm against his skin, sending a jolt of electricity through him. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, locked in an almost otherworldly silence. "You don't understand, do you?" Lyra finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. "This challenge, this wasn't just for fun. It was never just about the reward. Darren's brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? Lyra's gaze softened, and she looked away for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. When I first saw you, I didn't expect to feel anything. You were just another human, someone to entertain me for a while. But as you climbed, as you kept going, despite the odds, something changed. I started to care. Darren stood frozen, her words sinking in. For the first time since they had met, he realized just how serious she was. He had thought of this as just a game, a way to pass the time. But now, it seemed so much more than that. You care? He echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. He wasn't sure what he was expecting from her, but it wasn't this. Lyra nodded slowly, her eyes soft but filled with emotion. I didn't want to admit it, but I'd never felt this way before. You are different. Darren's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts swirling in 100 different directions. He had come to this place thinking he would prove himself, perhaps win a prize or a challenge. But now, standing here with Lyra, he couldn't deny the strange, undeniable connection he felt with her. He had been drawn to her from the moment they met, but now it seemed like more than just curiosity or attraction. It was something deeper, something that neither of them had expected. Lyra, Darren began, his voice shaky. I don't know what's happening, but I feel it too. This connection, it's real. For the first time since they had met, Lyra smiled without the mischievous gleam in her eyes. Her expression was softer, more genuine. I never thought it would be like this, she said, her voice filled with awe. I came here to have fun, to play with you, to see if you could survive the tests. But now, I find myself wanting something more. Darren stepped closer to her, unsure of what to say or do, but feeling the pull between them stronger than ever. His mind was racing, but his heart was telling him that this was something he couldn't ignore. You don't have to be afraid of it, Darren said softly, his voice filled with quiet certainty. Whatever this is, we can face it together. Lyra's gaze softened further, and for a moment, she seemed to lose herself in the depths of his eyes. She took a deep breath, and then, without another word, she leaned in, closing the distance between them. Darren's breath caught in his throat as their lips met, gently at first, testing the waters. But as the kiss deepened, the world around them seemed to disappear. There was no alien landscape, no challenges, no competition. Just the two of them, caught in the moment. When they finally pulled away, both of them were breathless, their hearts racing. Lyra looked at Darren with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty, as if she too had never experienced anything quite like this. This is real, isn't it? Lyra whispered. Darren smiled, taking her hand in his. Yes, it is. The wind blew softly through the forest, rustling the leaves as Lyra and Darren stood there, hand in hand, the stars overhead the only witness to their unspoken feelings. The kiss had felt like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another, one that neither of them had expected. The challenges Lyra had set for Darren were meant to be a game, a way to pass the time. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. They had both changed. Lyra looked down at their joined hands, still not quite sure how to process everything that had just happened. She had always prided herself on being independent, on keeping her emotions in check. She had never let herself get close to anyone, never allowed herself to care. And yet here she was, standing in front of a human who had somehow broken down the walls she had built around herself. Darren, for his part, was still trying to understand the flood of emotions coursing through him. He had come to this alien world expecting a challenge, expecting to prove something to himself. But now, with Lyra beside him, he realized that the challenge had been more than just physical. It had been about the connection between them, the undeniable pull that had drawn them together from the very beginning. I never thought this would happen, Lyra said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I never thought I would feel like this about a human. Darren turned to face her, his expression soft. I don't think either of us expected this, he said. But here we are, and I don't want to walk away from it. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. She had been so focused on the challenge on the game that she had never considered what might happen if things went beyond that. But now, standing here with Darren, she realized that what had started as a simple bet had turned into something far more complicated and far more important. "I don't know what this means," Lyra said, her voice laced with hesitation. "I don't know if it's even possible for someone like me, someone like us, to be together." Darren stepped closer to her, his hand gently lifting her chin so that she was looking directly into his eyes. "I don't know what the future holds," he said softly, "but I do know that I don't want to let go of what we have. I've never felt anything like this before, Lyra." For a long moment, they simply stood there, silently absorbing the weight of his words. Lyra could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a sensation that was both thrilling and terrifying. She had never allowed herself to get this close to anyone, especially not a human. But in the presence of Darren, something inside her shifted. She felt something she had never felt before, something raw and real. "You're different," Lyra said quietly, almost to herself. "I've never met anyone like you." Darren smiled gently, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You're not so different from me, Lyra. We're both just trying to figure this out." Lyra nodded slowly, her gaze softening as she looked up at him. For a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The strange alien world around them, the unknown future, and the differences between their species. All that mattered was the connection they had forged, the bond that had formed between them against all odds. But as the silence stretched between them, Lyra's mind began to race again. She had never allowed herself to be vulnerable, to let her guard down. She had always kept her emotions in check, always kept her distance. But now, with Darren standing so close to her, she felt an overwhelming desire to open up, to share herself with him in a way she never had before. "Why did you agree to the challenge?" Lyra asked suddenly, her voice steady but curious. "Was it really just for the reward, or was there something else?" Darren thought for a moment, his eyes searching hers. "At first, it was just a challenge. I wanted to prove I could do it. But as we went along, I started to feel something I couldn't explain. You were always there, watching me, guiding me, and somewhere along the way, I realized that I didn't just want to finish the challenge. I wanted to understand you. I wanted to know more." Lyra's heart fluttered at his words, a mixture of surprise and tenderness rising within her. She had never expected to hear such honesty from him. It was something she wasn't used to, but something she found herself yearning for. In that moment, she realized that she had been afraid of this, afraid of the connection between them, afraid of what it might mean. But now, she couldn't deny it any longer. "I never thought I could care for a human," Lyra admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But now I'm not so sure. Everything feels different with you." Darren gently cupped her face in his hands, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm willing to find out with you." Lyra felt a rush of emotion, her heart pounding as she looked at him. This was not just a game anymore, not just a challenge. This was something real, something they both had to figure out together. And for the first time, Lyra felt a glimmer of hope, a hope she had long since buried deep within her. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future for them, one that neither of them had expected, but one that they were both willing to explore. "I think I'm ready to find out too," Lyra said softly, her voice filled with quiet resolve. With that, they stood there, side by side, ready to face whatever came next. Together. The night had fallen completely, and the stars above seemed to shimmer with a strange intensity. Lyra and Darren sat side by side on a smooth rock near the peak, the cool night air brushing against their skin. The forest around them was quiet now, the only sounds being the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of unknown creatures. The tension that had once filled the air between them had softened, replaced by a more profound quietness, a space where words seemed both necessary and impossible. Darren glanced at Lyra, his heart still racing from the events of the evening. They had shared more than just a challenge. There had been something in her eyes, something in the way she had looked at him that told him she wasn't just playing a game anymore. He wasn't sure what it all meant, but one thing was clear. His feelings for her had grown into something real, something that couldn't be ignored. But even now, as they sat together, there was still an unspoken distance between them. Both of them had their own doubts, their own fears about what was happening. For Lyra, this was a new experience. She had never allowed herself to form such deep attachments, especially not to a human. For Darren, the feelings he had developed for her were as confusing as they were strong. He had never thought he'd be sitting on an alien planet, so far from home, caught up in such an unexpected connection. "Lyra," Darren said softly, breaking the silence, "I need to know something." Lyra turned to him, her glowing eyes catching the light of the stars. She had been silent for a long time, lost in her thoughts, but now her attention was fully on him. She could sense the seriousness in his voice. "What do you need to know, human?" she asked, her tone steady but gentle. Darren hesitated for a moment, unsure how to put his feelings into words. It wasn't that he didn't know what he was feeling. It was more that he was afraid of how she might react. But at the same time, he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. He had to know where they stood, or else this uncertainty would continue to hang between them. I need to understand," he began. "What are we doing here? What is this between us?" Lyra's gaze softened as she listened. She had expected this question to come, but hearing it out loud made her chest tighten. She had been avoiding it, not wanting to confront the reality of her emotions, but now she knew she couldn't avoid it any longer. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she replied quietly, looking away for a moment, as though searching for the right words. "I didn't expect to feel this way about you. When I first saw you, you were just a human, a game to pass the time. But now I can't deny it. Something inside me has changed. I'm not sure how or why, but I care about you, Darren." Darren's heart skipped a beat. Hearing her say those words, so honestly, made his own feelings surge to the surface. "I care about you too, Lyra," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect this either. But from the moment we started this challenge, I couldn't stop thinking about you. And now, I don't want to walk away from this. I don't want to walk away from you." Lyra turned back to him, her eyes locking onto his, as if searching for any sign of doubt. But there was none. The sincerity in his words made her heart flutter, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to fully embrace the emotion she had been holding back. "You're not like the others," Lyra said softly, almost to herself. "Humans, I mean. I've always kept my distance. I never let anyone in. But with you, it's different. It's like you see me, really see me. Not just an alien. Not just some challenge or game. You see me as who I am." Darren reached out and gently took her hand in his, squeezing it softly. "I don't care where you come from, Lyra. All I care about is what's in front of me. And right now, what's in front of me is you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their words hung in the air. And for the first time, Lyra felt truly understood. She wasn't just an alien. She wasn't just the mysterious woman who had set him a challenge. She was someone who was capable of feeling, of loving. And maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who could love her back. But as much as she wanted to embrace the feeling, there was a part of her that hesitated. Her mind raced with doubts. What would happen if they tried to build something together? Could a human and an alien truly have a future? There were so many uncertainties, so many questions without answers. The weight of their differences loomed large, and she wasn't sure if either of them was ready to face that. "I'm scared," Lyra admitted softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what this means. I don't know what happens next. I've never done this before." Darren squeezed her hand tighter, his gaze steady and filled with understanding. "Neither have I," he said quietly, "but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to figure it out with you, Lyra, together." Lyra looked at him for a long time, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and fear. She had spent so long keeping people at a distance, building walls around herself to protect her heart. But now, with Darren standing in front of her, those walls were starting to crumble. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the unknown. With Darren by her side, maybe they could face it together. "I want to try too," she said, her voice full of quiet determination. Darren smiled, the uncertainty between them slowly melting away. "Then we'll figure it out. Together." And with that, the two of them sat in the quiet of the night, their hands intertwined, ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed were filled with a new sense of clarity. Darren and Lyra spent more time together, their bond growing stronger with each passing moment. What had begun as a strange game, a playful challenge, had now transformed into something much more meaningful, something neither of them had anticipated. They found themselves drawn to each other in ways they couldn't explain, each moment spent together only deepening the connection they had formed. Darren often marveled at how natural it felt to be with Lyra. There were times when their conversations would flow effortlessly, as if they had known each other for a lifetime. Other times, they would simply sit in silence, content in each other's presence. They had their differences, yes, but they also shared something rare, a mutual understanding and respect that seemed to transcend everything else. One evening, as they sat on a hill overlooking a vast alien landscape, the sky painted in shades of purple and blue, Darren turned to Lyra with a serious expression on his face. "Lyra," he began, his voice soft, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. About us." Lyra looked at him, her glowing eyes reflecting the fading light. "I've been thinking too," she said, her voice quiet. "I didn't expect any of this. I didn't expect to care so much, and now I can't imagine my life without you in it." Darren smiled, his heart swelling at her words. There was something about hearing her admit her feelings, something that made all the uncertainty in him fade away. He had been afraid at first, afraid that their connection might be fleeting, that it might be just a momentary thing. But now, hearing Lyra speak so openly, he realized that what they had was real. It was deep. "I don't want this to end," Darren said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I don't want to go back to the way things were before. I don't want to lose this. Us." Lyra reached out, her hand gently brushing against his. "Neither do I," she replied, her voice full of emotion. "But there's so much about us that's different. You're human. I'm not. And even though I care for you, I don't know what that means in the long run. What happens if we try to build something together? What will people think?" Darren understood her concerns. He had thought about them too. Their worlds were so different, their cultures, their experiences. But he had never been one to let those differences stand in the way of something he believed in. And he believed in this. "We don't know what will happen," Darren said, his voice steady. "We don't know what the future holds. But I do know that I'm not willing to let fear stop me from trying. We can figure it out together." Lyra looked at him, her gaze searching his face for any sign of doubt. But there was none. He was completely sincere. She could see it in his eyes, the same determination she had seen in him from the moment they met. And in that moment, she knew that she wanted to try too. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," Lyra said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't want to hide behind the walls I've built around myself. I've spent so long pushing everyone away. But with you, it's different. You make me want to open up, to trust, even though it scares me." Darren smiled softly, reaching out to take her hand. "I'm here, Lyra. I'll be here, no matter what. I'll stand by you. You don't have to face this alone." The words felt like a promise, a vow that made Lyra's heart swell with warmth. For the first time in her life, she felt like she had found someone who understood her completely, someone who didn't judge her for her past or her fears. Darren didn't just accept her. He embraced everything that made her who she was. As they sat together, Watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, Lyra couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over her. For so long, she had kept her heart locked away, afraid of what might happen if she let someone in. But now, with Darren beside her, she realized that it wasn't so bad to be vulnerable. In fact, it felt liberating. It felt right. Darren, too, felt a sense of contentment that he hadn't experienced before. The uncertainty that had plagued him at the start of their journey was now gone, replaced by something much more powerful, a deep, abiding connection with Lyra. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to walk it without her. As the night deepened, the two of them sat there in silence, not needing words to communicate the bond they shared. They had both come from different worlds, with different histories and different paths. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the here and now. The feeling that they had found something truly special, something worth fighting for. And so, they sat together, side by side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together. The days turned into weeks, and Lyra and Darren's bond only deepened. What had started as a casual challenge between a human and an alien had transformed into something neither of them had expected. They had faced their fears, their doubts, and their differences, and now, together, they were starting to build something that felt as though it could last a lifetime. The sun was setting on another quiet evening, casting golden light across the alien landscape. Darren and Lyra sat by the edge of a small, calm lake, its surface reflecting the sky in shimmering colors. It was a peaceful moment, a perfect contrast to the whirlwind of emotions and thoughts that had occupied both of their minds in recent days. The air was warm, and the soft sounds of the alien wildlife filled the background. For once, everything felt still, as if the world around them had paused to give them this time. "Do you ever wonder how we got here?" Darren asked, breaking the comfortable silence. His voice was soft, thoughtful, as he stared out at the water. Lyra turned to look at him, her glowing eyes reflecting the colors of the sky. "How we got here. In this place, together." She paused, her lips curving into a small smile. "I think about it all the time. I never would have imagined that I would be sitting here with you, that I would care for you the way I do." Darren's smile softened. "I didn't think I'd ever be in a situation like this either. But now I can't imagine my life without you." Lyra's heart fluttered in her chest at his words. She had always kept people at a distance, built walls around herself to protect her emotions. She had never allowed herself to care so deeply, to open herself up in this way. But with Darren, it felt different. He wasn't just someone she had met along the way. He had become a part of her life, a part of her heart. And despite everything, despite the challenges they had faced and the differences between their worlds, she knew she didn't want to lose him. "I never thought I could love a human," Lyra said quietly, her voice filled with wonder. "But I do. And I don't care about the differences between our worlds anymore. All I care about is what we have, right here, right now." Darren turned to her, his expression filled with warmth and understanding. "I feel the same way. I don't care that you're from another world. I care about who you are, Lyra. You're the most incredible person I have ever met." A soft laugh escaped Lyra's lips, and for a moment, it felt like everything else in the universe faded away. It was just the two of them, sitting together in the quiet of the evening, their hearts in sync. They had both faced challenges, both from each other and from their worlds. But now, they were facing them together, and that made all the difference. Lyra reached out, her hand gently brushing against his. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice soft but full of honesty. "I'm scared of what comes next. We've made something beautiful here, but the future, it's so uncertain. I don't know what will happen when the world finds out about us, when people learn that a human and an alien are together." Darren's expression grew serious, but his hand remained firmly clasped around hers. "I know the future is uncertain, but I don't want to live my life in fear of what might happen. I want to take this chance with you. I'm not going to let anyone's opinions or the unknown stand in our way. We've built something real here, Lyra, and I believe that's worth fighting for." Lyra looked at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and uncertainty. For so long, she had pushed away the idea of being with anyone, of letting someone into her life. But Darren had changed everything. His unwavering belief in their connection had made her realize that love, true love, was worth the risks. It was worth the uncertainty. "I don't want to fight anymore," Lyra whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I don't want to fight what I feel for you. I don't want to fight this. Us." Darren's eyes softened as he reached out and cupped her face gently. "Then don't fight it," he said quietly. "We'll face whatever comes next, together. You and me. I'll always stand by you." Lyra smiled, her heart full. There were still so many unknowns in their future, so many questions that couldn't be answered. But in this moment, all that mattered was that they had each other. And that was enough. For the first time in a long while, Lyra felt at peace. The uncertainty of the future no longer weighed on her as it once had. She had found something she hadn't even known she was searching for. Someone who accepted her for who she was. Someone who loved her despite the differences between them. And in return, she had given him the same. "I don't know what will happen," Lyra said softly, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "But I do know this. I love you, Darren, and I'm willing to face whatever comes, as long as I'm with you." Darren's eyes shone with tenderness as he pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. "I love you too, Lyra," he whispered, his voice filled with sincerity. "And I'll never stop fighting for us." And with that, they sat together, watching the stars above them, knowing that no matter what the future held, they would face it as one, together.